Part 3. Transports. Introduction. Drawing in the broadest terms contrasts based on deficit or excess. We have always two universes of discourse, call them physical and phenomenal. Sooner or later there is something, physically, the matter. Their inner worlds, their dispositions, may indeed be altered, transformed, but, as becomes clear, this is due to some gross, and almost quantitative, change in neural function. In this third section, altered perception, imagination, dream. Such transports tend to be seen, like dreams, as psychical, as a manifestation, perhaps, of unconscious or preconscious activity, or, in the mystically minded, of something spiritual, not as something medical, let alone neurological. They have an intrinsic dramatic, or narrative, or personal sense, and so are not apt to be seen as symptoms. If God, or the eternal order, was revealed to Dostoevsky in seizures, why should not other organic conditions serve as portals to the beyond or the unknown? Hughlings-Jackson, in 1880, describing such transports, or portals, or dreamy states, in the course of certain epilepsies, used the general word reminiscence. He wrote, "I should never diagnose epilepsy from the paroxysmal occurrence of reminiscence, without other symptoms, although I should suspect epilepsy if that superpositive mental state began to occur very frequently. I have never been consulted for reminiscence only." The theme of this section is the power of imagery and memory to transport a person as a result of abnormal stimulation of the temporal lobes and limbic system of the brain. This may even teach us something of the cerebral basis of certain visions and dreams, and of how the brain, which Sherrington called an enchanted loom, may weave a magic carpet to transport us. 15. Reminiscence. Mrs. O.C. was somewhat deaf. In January 1979, she dreamt nostalgically, of her childhood in Ireland, and especially of the songs they danced to and sang. When she woke up, the music was still going, very loud and clear. She checked every radio she could find, they were all turned off. What radio station would play my songs, and nothing else? At this point she asked herself, is the radio in my head? Mrs. O.C. came to me, she could only hear me through the softer ones. She was bright, alert, not delirious or mad, but with a remote, absorbed look. I could find nothing neurologically amiss. Nonetheless, I suspected that the music was neurological. She was able to sleep after the first 3 nights and, increasingly, to make and hear conversation between songs. I used an electroencephalogram, paying special attention to the temporal lobes, the musical lobes of the brain. In the course of a 2-hour recording, she raised her finger on 3 occasions, and each time she did this the EEG pens clattered, and transcribed spikes and sharp waves in the temporal lobes of the brain. This confirmed that she was indeed having temporal lobe seizures, which, as Hughlings-Jackson guessed and Wilder-Penfield proved, are the invariable basis of reminiscence and experiential hallucinations. I obtained a brain scan, and this showed that she had indeed had a small thrombosis or infarction in part of her right temporal lobe. The sudden onset of Irish songs in the night, the sudden activation of musical memory traces in the cortex, were, apparently, the consequence of a stroke, and as it resolved, so the songs resolved too. By mid-April the songs had entirely gone. I asked her if she missed the songs she heard. She said, "Mostly, I would say, it is a great relief. But, yes, I do miss the old songs a little. Now, with lots of them, I can't even recall them. It was like being given back a forgotten bit of my childhood again. And some of the songs were really lovely." I had heard similar sentiments from some of my patients on L-Dopa. The term I used was incontinent nostalgia. Another case, Mrs. O.M. was also a woman in her 80s, also somewhat deaf. She, too, heard music in the head. Occasionally she heard voices talking, usually far away and several at once. She hadn't mentioned these symptoms to anybody, and had secretly worried, for 4 years. Mrs. O.C. recovered in a few weeks, but Mrs. O.M.'s music continued, and got worse and worse. At first it was just 3 songs. I asked, "Do they have some special meaning for you?" "No," she answered. "I never specially liked them, and I don't think they had any special meaning for me. I came to hate them." After this, and though it was worse in one way, it was also a relief. The inner music became more complex and various. I found nothing abnormal except in her hearing. She had some inner ear deafness, of a commonplace sort, but over and above this she had a peculiar difficulty in the perception and discrimination of tones of a kind which neurologists call amusia, and which is correlated with impaired function in the auditory, or temporal, lobes of the brain. When we did an EEG on Mrs. O.M., it showed high voltage and excitability in both temporal lobes, those parts of the brain associated with the central representation of sounds and music, and with the evocation of complex experiences and scenes. And whenever she heard anything, the high voltage waves became sharp, spike-like, and frankly convulsive. She had too a musical epilepsy, associated with disease of the temporal lobes. Musical epilepsy. In Thomas Mann's phrase, whereas epilepsy suggests quite the reverse, a crude, random physiological event, wholly unselective, without feeling or meaning. Thus a musical epilepsy or a personal epilepsy would seem a contradiction in terms. It is not very uncommon for epileptics to have vague and yet exceedingly elaborate mental states at the onset of epileptic seizures. The elaborate mental state, or so-called intellectual aura, is essentially the same. Wilder-Penfield was not only able to locate their origin in the temporal lobes, but was able to evoke the elaborate mental state, or experiential hallucinations of such seizures by gentle electrical stimulation of the seizure-prone points of the cerebral cortex. Such stimulations would instantly call forth intensely vivid hallucinations of tunes, people, scenes, which would be experienced, lived, as compellingly real. Jackson described this, when he spoke of the characteristic doubling of consciousness. There is, 1, the quasi-parasitical state of consciousness, dreamy state, and, 2, there are remains of normal consciousness, and thus, there is double consciousness. A mental diplopia. This was expressed in my two patients, Mrs. O.M. and Mrs. O.C. Such epileptic hallucinations or dreams are never fantasies, they are always memories, and memories of the most precise and vivid kind, accompanied by the emotions which accompanied the original experience. Their extraordinary and consistent detail, which was evoked each time the cortex was stimulated, and exceeded anything which could be recalled by ordinary memory, suggested to Penfield that the brain retained an almost perfect record of every lifetime's experience, that the total stream of consciousness was preserved in the brain, and, as such, could always be evoked or called forth. The variety, the absurdity, of such convulsive memories and scenes made Penfield think that such reminiscence was essentially meaningless and random. At operation it is usually quite clear that the evoked experiential response is a random reproduction of whatever composed the stream of consciousness during some interval of the patient's past life. It may have been. Penfield is impressed by the frequency of musical seizures, a 3% incidence in the more than 500 temporal lobe epileptics he has studied. In each case, the music was fixed and stereotyped. The same tune, or tunes, were heard again and again. Thus, these tunes were not only popular on the radio, but equally popular as hallucinatory seizures. They were, so to speak, the top 10 of the cortex. But, is there any reason, we must wonder, why particular songs, or scenes, are selected by particular patients for reproduction in their hallucinatory seizures? Penfield concludes, is quite at random, except that there is some evidence of cortical conditioning. He might be right, but I have gone back to Mrs. O.M. briefly, although, consciously, she cannot attribute to the three songs special feeling or meaning. She now recalls, and this is confirmed by others, that she was apt to hum them, unconsciously, long before they became hallucinatory seizures. This suggests that they were already unconsciously selected, a selection which was then seized on by a supervening organic pathology. The month after I saw Mrs. O.M., there was an article in the New York Times entitled "Did Shostakovich Have a Secret?" The secret of Shostakovich was the presence of a metallic splinter, a mobile shell fragment, in his brain, in the temporal horn of the left ventricle. Shostakovich was very reluctant, apparently, to have this removed, since the fragment had been there. He said, each time he leaned his head to one side he could hear music. His head was filled with melodies different each time, which he then made use of when composing. X-rays allegedly showed the fragment moving around when Shostakovich moved his head, pressing against his musical temporal lobe, when he tilted, producing an infinity of melodies which his genius could use. After reading the article I gave it to Mrs. O.M. to read. I am no Shostakovich, she said. I can't use my songs. Anyhow, I'm tired of them, they're always the same. I put Mrs. O.M. on anticonvulsants, and she forthwith ceased her musical convulsions. I asked her if she missed them. Not on your life, she said. I'm much better without them. It may be that such seizures have both a physiological and a personal origin, coming from particular charged parts of the brain, but, equally, meeting particular psychic circumstances and needs. In Mrs. O.C.'s case the nostalgic need was more chronic and profound, for her father died before she was born, and her mother before she was 5. Orphaned, alone, she was sent to America, to live with a rather forbidding maiden aunt. Mrs. O.C. had no conscious memory of the first 5 years of her life, no memory of her mother, of Ireland, of home. She had always felt this as a keen and painful sadness, this lack, or forgetting, of the earliest, most precious years of her life. She had often tried, but never succeeded, to recapture her lost and forgotten childhood memories. Now, with her dream, and the long dreamy state which succeeded it, she recaptured a crucial sense of her forgotten, lost childhood. The feeling she had was not just ictal pleasure, but a trembling, profound and poignant joy. It was, as she said, like the opening of a door which had been stubbornly closed all her life. Book, A Collection of Moments, 1970, Esther Solomon speaks of the necessity to preserve, or recapture, the sacred and precious memories of childhood, and how impoverished, ungrounded, life is without these. For Mrs. O.C., nearly 90, approaching the end of a long lonely life, this recapturing of sacred and precious childhood memories, this strange and almost miraculous anamnesis, breaking open the closed door, the amnesia of childhood, was provided, paradoxically, by a cerebral mishap. Unlike Mrs. O.M., who wanted treatment, Mrs. O.C. declined anticonvulsants. "I need these memories," she would say. Dostoevsky had psychical seizures, or elaborate mental states at the onset of seizures, and once said of these, "You all, healthy people, can't imagine the happiness which we epileptics feel during the second before our fit. I don't know if this felicity lasts for seconds, hours, or months, but believe me, I would not exchange it for all the joys that life may bring." Tielajwanin, 1963. As she got better, Mrs. O.C. had a period of wistfulness and fear. "The door is closing," she said. "I'm losing it all again." And indeed, she did lose, by the middle of April. But Mrs. O.C., epileptic reminiscence here seized on something unconscious very early, childhood experiences, either faded, or repressed from consciousness and restored them, convulsively, to full memory and consciousness. And though, physiologically, the door did close, the experience itself was not forgotten, but left a profound and enduring impression, and was felt as a significant and healing experience. There's no longer a great chunk of childhood missing. I can't remember the details now, but I know it's all there. There's a sort of completeness I never had before. An ultimate serenity and security of spirit as is only given to those who possess, or recall, the true past. Postscript. Reminiscence is to replace false or fantastic reminiscences by a true memory, or anamnesis, of the past. A case like Mrs. O.C.'s is that it is at once Jacksonian and Freudian. She suffered from a Jacksonian reminiscence, but this served to moor and heal her, as a Freudian anamnesis. What occurs, in these wholly personal experiential seizures, is an entire replay of, a segment of, experience. As both suffered from reminiscence, a convulsive upsurge of melodies and scenes, a sort of hypernesis and hypergnosis, our amnesic agnosic patients have lost their inner melodies and scenes. Both testify to the essentially melodic and scenic nature of inner life, the Proustian nature of memory and mind. Stimulate a point in the cortex of such a patient, and there convulsively unrolls a Proustian evocation or reminiscence. So, what sort of cerebral organization could allow this to happen? Can we have a personal or Proustian physiology, over and above the mechanical, Sherringtonian one? When he imagines the mind as an enchanted loom, weaving ever-changing yet always meaningful patterns, weaving, in effect, patterns of meaning. Personal patterns would have to take the form of scripts or scores as abstract patterns. Patterns for a computer must take the form of schemata or programs. Thus, above the level of cerebral programs, we must conceive a level of cerebral scripts and scores. There is something extremely important, and frightening here, the possibility of a real psychosurgery, a neurosurgery of identity, infinitely finer and more specific than our gross amputations and lobotomies, which may damp or deform the whole character, but cannot touch individual experiences. Experience is not possible until it is organized iconically, action is not possible unless it is organized iconically. The brain's record of everything alive must be iconic. By the same token, if the brain's representations are damaged or destroyed, as in the amnesias, agnosias, apraxias, their reconstitution, if possible, demands a double approach, an attempt to reconstruct damaged programs and systems as is being developed, extraordinarily, by Soviet neuropsychology, or a direct approach at the level of inner melodies and scenes. Now is the time to recall them, reuse them, so that there may arise, in our own time, a new and beautiful existential science and therapy, which can join with the systematic, to give us a comprehensive understanding and power. 16. Incontinent nostalgia. One of the most astonishing effects of L-DOPA, when given to certain post-encephalitic patients, is the reactivation of symptoms and behavior patterns present at a much earlier stage of the disease, but subsequently lost. A striking example of forced reminiscence induced by L-DOPA was seen in the case of a 63-year-old woman who had had progressive post-encephalitic Parkinsonism since the age of 18 and had been institutionalized, in a state of almost continuous oculogyric trance, for 24 years. L-DOPA produced, at first, a dramatic release from her Parkinsonism and oculogyric entrancement, allowing almost normal speech and movement. Soon there followed, as in several of our patients, a psychomotor excitement with increased libido. This period was marked by nostalgia, joyful identification with a youthful self, and uncontrollable upsurge of remote sexual memories and illusions. She said, "I can't understand it. I haven't heard or thought of those things for more than 40 years. I never knew I still knew them. But now they keep running through my mind. Increasing excitement necessitated a reduction of the dosage of L-Dopa, and with this the patient, although remaining quite articulate, instantly forgot all these early memories and was never again able to recall a single line of the songs she had recorded. Forced reminiscence usually associated with a sense of déjà vu, and, in Jackson's term, a doubling of consciousness occurs rather commonly in attacks of migraine and epilepsy, in hypnotic and psychotic states, in response to the powerful mnemonic stimulus of certain words, sounds, scenes, and especially smells. Everybody is stacked with an almost infinite number of dormant memory traces, some of which can be reactivated under conditions of overwhelming excitement. Such traces, we conceive like the subcortical imprints of remote events far below the horizon of mental life, are indelibly etched in the nervous system, and may persist indefinitely in a state of abeyance, due either to lack of excitation or to positive inhibition. The forced reminiscence induced by L-Dopa, cortical probes, migraines, epilepsies, crises, etc. would seem to be, primarily, an excitation, while the incontinently nostalgic reminiscence of old age, and sometimes of drunkenness, seems closer to a disinhibition and uncovering of archaic traces. All of these states can release memory, and all of them can lead to a re-experience and reenactment of the past. 17. A Passage to India. Bhagahandi P., an Indian girl of 19 with a malignant brain tumor, an astrocytoma. In her 18th year, the tumor recurred, and no longer removable. A decompression was performed to allow its expansion. She had weakness and numbness of the left side, with occasional seizures and other problems. As the tumor inched forward to her temporal lobe and the decompression started to bulge, her seizures became more frequent. She would not lose consciousness, but she would look, and feel, dreamy, and it was easy to ascertain, and confirm by EEG, that she was now having frequent temporal lobe seizures, characterized by dreamy states and involuntary reminiscence. Soon it took the form of visions of India landscapes, villages, homes, gardens which Bhagahandi recognized as places she had known and loved as a child. Were these all temporal lobe seizures? They tend to have a rather fixed format, a single scene or song, whereas Bhagahandi's dreams had no such fixity, but presented ever-changing panoramas and dissolving landscapes to her eye. Was she then toxic and hallucinating from the massive doses of steroids she was now receiving? This seemed possible, but we could not reduce the steroids. She would have gone into coma and died within days. A steroid psychosis, so-called, is often excited and disorganized, whereas Bhagahandi was always lucid, peaceful, and calm. Day by day, week by week, the dreams, the visions, came oftener, grew deeper. They occupied most of the day. We would see her rapt, her eyes sometimes closed, sometimes open but unseeing, and always a faint, mysterious smile on her face. If anyone approached her, or asked her something, she would respond at once, lucidly and courteously. But we have a feeling that she was in another world, and that we should not interrupt her. Once, I said, "Bhagahandi, what is happening?" "I am dying," she answered. "I am going home. I am going back where I came from." Another week passed, though her eyes were closed, her face still bore its faint, happy smile. "She's on the return journey," the staff said. "She'll soon be there." 3 days later she died, or should we say she arrived, having completed her passage to India. 18. The Dog Beneath the Skin. Stephen D., aged 22, medical student, on highs, cocaine, PCP, chiefly amphetamines. Dreamt he was a dog, in a world unimaginably rich and significant in smells. The happy smell of water. Waking, he found himself in just such a world. As if I had been totally color-blind before, and suddenly found myself in a world full of color. I could distinguish dozens of browns where I'd just seen brown before, and a dramatic enhancement of eidetic visual perception and memory I could never draw before. I saw everything, as if projected on the paper, and just drew the outlines I saw. Suddenly I could do the most accurate anatomical drawings. But the exaltation of smell which really transformed his world. I had dreamt I was a dog, and now I awoke in a world in which all other sensations, enhanced as they were, paled before smell. He found he could distinguish all his friends and patients by smell. He could smell their emotions: fear, contentment, sexuality. He could recognize every street, every shop, by smell. Sexual smells were exciting and increased, but no more so than food smells and other smells. But it seemed to him less a world of mere pleasure and displeasure than a whole aesthetic, a whole judgment, a whole new significance, which surrounded him. After 3 weeks, this strange transformation ceased. "I'm glad to be back," he said, "but it's a tremendous loss, too. I see now what we give up in being civilized and human." Freud wrote of man's sense of smell as being a casualty, repressed in growing up and civilization, with the assumption of an upright posture and the repression of primitive, pregenital sexuality. Specific, and pathological, enhancements of smell have indeed been reported as occurring in paraphilia, fetishism, and allied perversions and regressions. but the disinhibition here described seems probably an amphetamine-induced dopaminergic excitation, was neither specifically sexual nor associated with sexual regression. What we see is the civilization need to inhibit what had regarded as primordial and full of feeling tone, and called protopathic, in order to allow the emergence of the sophisticated, categorizing, affectless epicritic. The need for such inhibition cannot be reduced to the Freudian. Perhaps we need it, as head implies, that we may be men and not dogs. Postscript. A corollary of this case, a gifted man who sustained a head injury, severely damaging his olfactory tracts and, in consequence, entirely losing his sense of smell. He has been startled and distressed at the effects of this sense of smell. It was like being struck blind. There was an acute sense of loss, and an acute sense of yearning, a veritable osmolgia. And then, some months later, his favorite morning coffee, which had become insipid, started to regain its savor. The neurologists had held out no hope of recovery. He returned to his doctor. But after testing him minutely, his doctor said, "No, I'm sorry, there's not a trace of recovery. What seems to be happening, and it is important that it was only the olfactory tracts, not the cortex, which were damaged, is the development of a greatly enhanced olfactory imagery, a controlled hallucinosis, to think that smells are real. This power, part conscious, part unconscious, has intensified and spread. We know that such a compensation often occurs with the blind and the deaf. We think of the deaf Beethoven and the blinded Prescott. But I have no idea whether it is common with anosmia. Somewhat similar states a strange emotionalism, sometimes nostalgia, reminiscence, and déjà vu associated with intense olfactory hallucinations, are characteristic of uncinate seizures, a form of temporal lobe epilepsy. There is a generalized intensification of smell, a hyperosmia. The uncus, phylogenetically part of the ancient smell brain, or rhinencephalon, is functionally associated with the whole limbic system, which is increasingly recognized to be crucial in determining and regulating the entire emotional tone. Excitation of this produces heightened emotionalism and an intensification of the senses. 19. Murder. Donald killed his girl while under the influence of PCP. He had, or seemed to have, no memory of the deed. Therefore, it was concluded when he stood trial, not a repression of memory, but an organic amnesia, the sort of blackout well described with PCP. The details were macabre, and could not be revealed in open court. Comparison was made with the acts of violence occasionally committed during temporal lobe or psychomotor seizures. Those who commit them are considered neither responsible nor culpable. He spent 4 years in a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. He had always been interested in plants. He took over its ragged, untended grounds, and created flower gardens, gardens of all sorts. Some considered him schizoid, some sane. Everyone felt he had achieved a sort of stability. In his 5th year he started to go out on parole, being allowed to leave the hospital on weekend passes. He had been an avid cyclist, and he bought a bike. He was pedaling, fast, down a steep hill when an oncoming car, badly driven, suddenly loomed on a blind turn. Swerving to avoid a head-on collision, he lost control, and was flung violently, head first, onto the road. He sustained a severe head injury, massive bilateral subdural hematomas, which were at once surgically evacuated and drained, and severe contusion of both frontal lobes. He lay in a coma, hemiplegic, for almost 2 weeks, and then, unexpectedly, he started to recover. And now, the nightmares began. The returning of consciousness was not sweet. Donald kept crying, "Oh God," and no. As consciousness grew clearer, so memory, full memory. There were severe neurological problems, left-sided weakness and numbness, seizures, and severe frontal lobe deficits, and with these, the murder, the deed, lost to memory before, now stood before him in vivid, almost hallucinatory detail. Uncontrollable reminiscence welled up and overwhelmed him. He kept seeing the murder, enacting it, again and again. What he now showed was a genuine, if uncontrollable, reminiscence. He now knew the minutest details of the murder, all the details revealed by forensic examination, but never revealed in open court or to him. He twice attempted suicide on the neurosurgical unit and had to be heavily tranquilized and forcibly restrained. What was happening with him? There was a psychotic, or near psychotic, charge to the memories. They were, in psychiatric parlance, intensely or overcathected. Was it possible that with the loss of frontal lobe integrity an essential prerequisite for repression had been lost, and that what we now saw was a sudden, explosive, and specific to repression? All of us were very familiar with the general disinhibition seen in frontal lobe syndromes, the impulsiveness, the facetiousness, etc., but Donald was not impulsive, unselective, inappropriate, in the least. His character, judgment, and general personality were wholly preserved. It was solely memories and feelings of the murder which now erupted uncontrollably, obsessing and tormenting him. Was there a specific excitatory or epileptic element involved? Here EEG showed that in addition to the occasional grand mal seizures he had, there was a deep epilepsy, in both temporal lobes, extending down into the uncus, the amygdala, the limbic structures, the emotional circuitry which lies deep to the temporal lobes. None of us had heard of such a patient re-experiencing, or rather reenacting, a deed, but this apparently was what was happening with Donald. No clear decision was ever reached. Today, his frontal lobe functions now are almost normal. The use of new anticonvulsants, only available in the last few years, have allowed effective control of his temporal lobe seething. Finally, with sensitive and supportive regular psychotherapy, Donald's self-accusing superego has been mitigated, and Donald has now returned to gardening. I feel at peace gardening, he says to me. No conflicts arise. Plants don't have egos. They can't hurt your feelings. The final therapy, as Freud said, is work and love. Donald has not forgotten, or re-repressed, anything of the murder if, indeed, repression was operative in the first place, but he is no longer obsessed by it. A physiological and moral balance has been struck. Asterisk in one case, recorded by Penfield, a girl of 12, seemed to herself, in every seizure, to be running frantically from a murderous man who was pursuing her with a writhing bag of snakes. This experiential hallucination was a precise replay of an actual horrid incident, which had occurred 5 years before. 20. The Visions of Hildegard. The religious literature of all ages is replete with descriptions of visions, in the vast majority of cases, whether the experience represents a hysterical or psychotic ecstasy, the effects of intoxication, or an epileptic or migrainous manifestation. A unique exception is of Hildegard of Bingen, a nun, who experienced countless visions from earliest childhood to the close of her life. Varieties of migraine hallucination represented in the visions of Hildegard. They were indisputably migrainous, and they illustrate, indeed, many of the varieties of visual aura earlier discussed. Hildegard writes, "The visions which I saw I beheld neither in sleep, nor in dreams, nor in madness, nor with my carnal eyes, nor with the ears of the flesh, nor in hidden places, but wakeful, alert, and with the eyes of the spirit and the inward ears, I perceive them in open view and according to the will of God." Such is Hildegard's allegorical interpretation. Our literal interpretation would be that she experienced a shower of phosphens in transit across the visual field, their passage being succeeded by a negative scotoma. Invested with this sense of ecstasy, burning with profound theophorus and philosophical significance, Hildegard's visions were instrumental in directing her towards a life of holiness and mysticism. They provide a unique example of the manner in which a physiological event, banal, hateful or meaningless to the vast majority of people, can become, in a privileged consciousness, the substrate of a supreme ecstatic inspiration. There are moments, and it is only a matter of 5 or 6 seconds, when you feel the presence of the eternal harmony. A terrible thing is the frightful clearness with which it manifests itself and the rapture with which it fills you. If this state were to last more than 5 seconds, the soul could not endure it and would have to disappear. During these 5 seconds I live a whole human existence, and for that I would give my whole life and not think that I was paying too dearly.